So thank you all for coming. I'm glad that you all could be here. Hopefully everyone got pizza and some libations or water or whatever. First, before we begin, hopefully you've all logged into the guest network. Everyone, yes? Those who are participating. You have a GitHub account that you plan on using? Yes? How many of you actually went to this repo and started doing some stuff? Don't worry if you haven't. I'm going to actually walk you through it. But for those of you overachievers in the group, kudos to you. So before we begin, how many of you are manual testers, or maybe you're like a hybrid role where you do some manual testing, some automated testing? So any manual testers only? Okay. Any hybrid roles? Okay, and then the real question, who has never run an automated test ever?
You're in a brave space. I don't believe in safe spaces, but you're in a brave space.
Okay.
You're brave. Yes.
Even if you're lying, that's fine.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right, so what my goal for all of you today is to, for A, run your first automated test, and B, to actually maybe understand, like from a granular point of view, like what actually goes into the thought process of writing an automated test, and how maybe you can leverage your existing knowledge as a manual tester and translate that into automated testing skills. So without further adu, we'll talk about the agenda. So obviously most of you in the room are like pretty versed with testing theory and software testing 101 stuff. But for the sake of the video and for the internet, we're going to go over some prerequisite knowledge. Then we'll talk about the first steps to automated testing, what that looks like from a very high level point of view, what you need to expect when you're going to write your first automated test, what are the outcomes that you're expecting, et cetera. And then we're actually going to do some hands-on activity. So we're going to write our first test. We're going to be testing against the Sauce Labs demo app, which I implore you to use on your own testing. Like if you have a script that you want to know if it works, feel free to use our app. And then we'll talk about what your test, when you want to scale your test skills, what that might look like. So we'll talk about parallel testing, we'll talk about mobile testing, we'll talk about testing with frameworks, we'll talk about the page object model, et cetera. So any questions before we begin? No questions, okay. Also, before we go forward, I want to introduce 3 of our TAs. So once we get to the hands-on portion, they will be a valuable resource. From left to right, we have Enrique. We have Michael.
Yes.
In the middle, we got Michael.
Yes, right up to Michael.
And on the right, we got Morali.
Yes, Morali.
Okay, so before we go any further, let's talk a little bit about who I am. As Tristan mentioned, I am James Tacker. I am a technical content producer. Pretty much a year and a half ago-ish, I didn't know anything about Selenium. I came from a fine arts background. I don't have a CS degree. So I'm living proof that you can learn this stuff. It's not that difficult as long as you put in some effort. And if you get excited about it, you'll go very far in your automated testing journey. So a little bit more information. Again, I started out liberal fine arts. I'm self-taught. And I love Spider-Man. I promise this is the only one of 2 memes that you will see tonight. So, okay, so software testing examples. How many of you are familiar with any or all of the testing methods that you see on the screen here? Okay, so I'm sorry to bore you guys, but I like talking about this stuff because I think it's interesting. So I won't go over all of them, but a lot of manual testing, some manual testing and some automated testing frameworks or theories rather. Overlap. For example, black box is a example because Selenium testing is directly related to black box testing. And black box testing is basically you have no idea what the internal workings are of the system that you're testing, as opposed to white box testing, which is sort of the opposite. You have direct knowledge of how things are supposed to be working, and i.e. the source code. And then you have alpha testing, which is pretty much a common type of testing that's used usually near the end of the software development lifecycle. And then you have, of course, unit testing, which any developers in the audience, by the way? Yeah, so you're familiar with unit testing. You're basically testing a component, a unit of your code, and then a component testing is you're testing a component of your code. Then you have integration testing for automated testing. So that's, let's say you have your standalone application, and then you are integrating it or interfacing it with other like programs or software, and you need to test to see if that connection and the call and response is actually working. Then you have regression testing, which is, let's say something changed, you need to make sure that it didn't break and it still works. So that's what you can use for regression testing. So that's basically software testing 101 in like 2 minutes. Now, I don't want to scare anyone, but you do have room to be excited that manual testing is not going away anytime soon. And here's a couple scenarios where you may actually encounter at your job, where your role is very important as a manual tester. And if you have a manual testing background, you can still do these tasks, which makes you even more of a superhero. So for example, I'll just go over a few of these. You need to verify some bug fixes and enhancements before a patch and release go out. Let's say the dev ran a lot of automated tests, or it ran through a CI build. Maybe the CI build failed or something like that. This is a good way to actually manually go in and verify that everything is working the way it's supposed to be doing, and that it's not some confounding variable that's causing the test to fail. Also, you can train some automation and dev people into the functional or behavioral testing theories of your organization, because everyone has their own thought process and work process of how you actually do manual testing, so that they write code the way your company likes to write code. Also, UAT is never going to go away. It's really good for discovery, discovering bugs, discovering problems. And if you have a manual testing background and you also know a little bit about automated, your communication channel, you're less likely to work in silos with your dev team. Okay, any questions so far? So that was the introductory stuff before we get into the fun stuff. So just a FYI, I prefer to talk less and have you guys actually do stuff, because I know people like to do things with their hands. So we're going to hopefully get to the meat and bones of the presentation pretty soon. But before we do that, we need to actually address the elephant in the room. If you do plan on being an automation engineer, you need to know at least basic level programming languages, you maybe just conditionals and loops and things like that. But these are my top 3 that I would choose, or the most accessible. These are somewhat high-level languages before you go to low-level languages like C# or Java or something like that. And there's no particular order. It's just one of the 3 I think are the easiest to start with. And then operational tools, you don't really need to know those. You just need to be aware of them. Because if you do get a job as an automation engineer, you are most likely going to be working on a cloud platform or something of that effect. So knowing things like AWS, GCP, or Azure will be very beneficial to you. If you go maybe a little bit lower in the stack and you're on the network team or something like that, maybe you need to know about containers and load balancers and server configs and things like that. Also, knowing some command line will also help you as well. Okay, so when you're preparing to write your first script, the first thing you're going to do is actually do it in plain English. So you're going to create or gather a requirement sheet. And as a manual tester, you're probably familiar with how to do this. So what you do is you need to ask yourself, take a step back from a macro point of view and ask, what does this application actually do? Or what does this page of this application do? Or what is this function on this page supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera. And then the most important 2 parts that I would like to highlight are the last 2 bullets. So when we talk about test-driven development, basically you write the test before you write the code, or before you write the function, the feature. And focusing on the outcome or the results of said feature is very important. So if you're thinking about a page or a view on a mobile application or an application, you're going to wonder, what should the results be of my user input? Or what should the incorrect results be? And that will really inform not only the name of your test, but also the function of the test. So this is our Swag Labs app that we're going to be demoing today. We're going to be writing all of our tests against this application. Most likely, as an automation engineer, you won't be doing it this way. The application won't be publicly available, and then you're writing tests against it. But for the sake of today, that's the way we're going to do it. Now, going back 2 slides when we talked about our requirement sheet. Requirement sheet is the first step. The second step is to infer how you're going to write your test based on your requirement sheet. So I use this quote from Isaac Asimov. Any sci-fi fans in here? Any sci-fi novels fans? Yeah. So the first thing about cooking rabbit stew is catching the rabbit. I'm not a literary person at all, but I think what he's trying to say is you can't run before you walk. So what you need to do is identify the human actions from the functions of your application, and those in turn will infer what you're going to write your test as. So let's think of a login function on a page. You know immediately you're going to need to test if that login actually works or not. So you're going to have 2 tests. You're going to have one for a valid login and one for an invalid login. Then you may want to, depending on how much you want to abstract away from that, you can also include what if someone tries to do SQL injection or something like that, or maybe someone wants to have an old login or an incorrect email or an email reset or something like that. It's as big as you want to scale it out. But at the very bare bones, you need at least 2 tests. OK, so now, while you're all here, we're going to talk about Selenium. So I will talk about Selenium in 5 minutes. You can even time me. I'm going to try to make sure that this is the quickest version of Selenium that you're going to get. But you need to pause for the demos, because if you don't pause for the demos, then it's a false positive.
Well.
I shouldn't have said that. OK, so these are the same setup instructions that you saw earlier. I'm actually going to do this and show you how to do it, for those of you who haven't done it. Anyone done and already in Gitpod? 1, 2, OK. So FYI, Gitpod's really cool if you're trying to do POC for customers or you just don't want to pay for an IDE. It's like a really good way. It's basically VS Code in a browser. So the way it works, and this is the screen to the GitHub repo. You go to the repo, which is github.com/labs-training. I should probably just read it on my own screen, right? Crash course in automated Selenium testing. That's the name of the repo. Then you're going to select whatever language you prefer. So pick your poison, whether it's Python, Ruby, or Java. Today, I'm going to do Ruby just because I think Ruby's kind of cool, and it's also very readable. It's like the closest to English that I can finagle. And then these are the instructions. So when I get here, it's going to tell me my prerequisites for a local setup. Now, the local setups we're not going to do today, which basically implies that you're going to be doing it on your own laptop. You can do this at home, but we're not going to do that just for the sake of time today. So instead, we're going to use Gitpod. So hopefully, most of you said you had a Gitpod account. First thing you want to do is click on this button, and it's actually going to open Gitpod. Now, for those of you logging in for the first time, it's going to ask you to allow GitHub to log in to Gitpod. And it's just, I think it's only sharing like email or some basic metadata. And essentially what it's doing is it's taking that repo and it's cloning it in a VS Code IDE in a browser somewhere, hosted somewhere else. So what you see here is, oh, it's just doing some initialization stuff. OK. So on the left, on this panel here, we have all the code that we just saw in the repo. In the middle here, we have the README. On the bottom, we have a bash terminal, which we're going to be actually interfacing with in a minute. And then on the right, we have I think this is a web view into I want to say a Linux VM. So when we run our test, we will actually see it appear over here on the right. OK, so let's go back to the slides really quickly. So actually, I'll give everyone a second to do this. And then for those of you participating, can you just give me a thumbs up when you're good to go? I'll give you maybe 2-3 minutes. Does that sound good? And in the meantime, we can ask questions too. All right, so I'm going to go ahead then and keep moving along here. So what is it that you need to know about Selenium? How many of you are already familiar with Selenium? OK, cool. So this is going to be a little bit of a review. From a high level, it's essentially an automated testing tool. A lot of people like to call it an automated testing framework, but it's not actually a framework. It's more to use our head of professional services. He calls it a robot, hence the Selenium bot, because essentially you're just using a process or a tool and the protocol, which I'll get into in a minute, to communicate with either an application or browser, something external, right? So if Selenium is the tool, it uses the W3C Web Driver protocol, which you can think of as kind of like the language that tool is using to communicate with the browser. And to actually get it running on your own laptop, it's pretty simple. You just download the Selenium language bindings. If you're using Java, you'll have to download like a standalone server. And then you also install the WebDriver specific for whatever browser you want to communicate. Now the thing with, you need to remember if you're going to go home and do this, is if you are going to communicate with the browser, you need to make sure that you have that version of the browser installed on your laptop, as well as the Chrome driver for a Firefox driver. Otherwise, you're going to get some errors. Which is, again, why we're using Gitpod, because we can control that stuff. OK, so the W3C Web Driver protocol, I linked to the documentation here. It's pretty much, it acts as the interface for Selenium. And the protocol, again, is W3C is the protocol, the web protocol that we're using to communicate with that interface. And whenever you write a script, it's actually the very first thing you should do is instantiate a driver or / create a driver so that you know that it's going to interact with a browser or an application. So that's what we're going to do first. So if we go back to our handy dandy test here. Before we do that, any questions? No? Yes? OK. I'm going to go into Crash Course Ruby. I'm going to click on local, and then I'm going to open this local example here. So I've commented out some stuff. Maybe you can't see it. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. Is that better? Okay. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is actually ensure that we're using the Selenium Web Driver, which is installed on this machine. For local runs, you would need to uncomment this section, but we're not. We're using a remote run, i.e. gitpod. So essentially what we're going to do here is uncomment this bottom section here from line 10 to about 18. So now when I go down to this terminal below here at the bottom and I type in Ruby to run the script, you should see a browser pop up on the right side. Now essentially we're not really doing anything, we're actually just opening the browser. It would help if I actually go to the correct directory first. So go to Crash Course Ruby, and then type in Ruby local, and then local example.rb. And oh, I forgot to uncomment a certain line here, sorry. Okay, so first thing I do is I need to install the gems, which I did not do. For Ruby, it's a Ruby thing. So after those dependencies get installed, I can run Ruby, and it should work. So on the right, you didn't really get to see it, so I'll run it one more time. So on the right here, you run the Ruby command for local/local_example.rb. And on the right here, you will see the browser open and close very, very quickly. So quickly you may not even see anything happen. But that's okay. We haven't actually written a test yet. We're just doing it step by step. Anyone get that working? No? Okay, why don't I'll go over it again.
We're going to edit this out. There you go.
You just gave me another beer. I'm sorry, what? It was just a bundle install. So sorry, that's probably the step you're missing. So when you go to this directory over here in the terminal, you need to type in bundle space install.
Does that make sense for everyone? Yeah?
Let me see if I can make it bigger.
That'd be awesome.
And get rid of this notification.
Yes.
Oh, network problems. I was afraid of this. Okay. So you're in Crash Course Ruby. This is the command you need to run first. So bundle install. And then it will download all of the dependencies that you need. And just really, really quick, is anyone still on the Git pod? Like, you see that little box? Is anyone not even here yet? Yeah. Oh, that's... Okay, so my bad, guys. That's one thing I should have mentioned and I forgot to. If you get lost and you fall behind, there is actually a README in every single directory that goes through what you should do for each exercise. So for example, the first one down here, and actually it's probably better if I show you here. So let's say you're in the Ruby example right here. If you actually scroll down a little bit, this is what you're supposed to do here. So you go to open local example.rb, assuming you're in the Ruby directory, uncomment those specific lines, and in the terminal you run that command. And then of course here, I didn't follow my own instructions. I didn't do these two commands, so gem bundle install, and then bundle install. And then for those of you doing Python, we should have the equivalent. So I'm just walking you through that really quickly. Yeah, so in Python you have the same thing. And make sure you have pip3 installed, which I think in Gitpod it installs by default. And then you run pip3 install -r requirements.txt to install all the dependencies. So another important thing to talk about while you guys are all working on that, we actually haven't run a test yet. All we did essentially was open a browser, right? So Let me ask a question. What do you think constitute a test? And what constitute a test? Like, how do you define a test? Like, because that wasn't a test. What do you think you need for a test?
Oh, we have in the back.
Someone said steps. That's good.
Steps.
What else? Input and output, like user input output. Yes, at least simulation of thereof. Right. What else? Yep. Expected results. You need all three of those things to actually call it a test, and we will get there. So, but right now we've only done step one, which is instantiate a browser. Okay? All right, so I know some people are still working on it. Let's go to the next phase. Okay, so before you actually write your test, we've created a browser, we've opened the browser, now what, right? So what do we need to do? We need to find an application to work with, and we need to actually find how we're going to locate and identify things to interact with on the page. And what we call that in Selenium lingo is elements, right? We're basically using locators to locate elements on the page or application view and then interact with them. So because we're using a web application, we're going to be talking about HTML today primarily. So the HTML document object model, which is what HTML DOM stands for. And the elements that are on the page could be anything. Could be a contact form, could be an image, could be a link, et cetera, et cetera. And the way you identify those objects are, there's a couple of ways. These are probably the from order of fastest, quote unquote fastest to slowest. You have your IDs. So sometimes developers do this cool thing where they actually assign IDs to elements, which is really good for you as an automation engineer. Or you could use the class names if it has one in the document object model. Or if it's, if it doesn't have either and you need to be kind of creative with locating your elements, you can use one of the bottom two strategies, which is the CSS or XPath locator. Now, oops, sorry, I jumped around. So CSS is exactly what it sounds like. You're using attributes of the element to actually locate it. So maybe the attribute has a type attribute, maybe it is a div element, maybe it is a paragraph element. And the more specific you are with that locator, the better your test will run. XPath is actually, if you think about the document object model, XPath is actually nodes. So every element has a node on the document. The XPath is its exact position in the node, right? So it's kind of like saying, if there's 10,000 lines in the document and this element exists on line blah, 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 you're telling it to go to that line to interact with that specific element. So as you can imagine, that's very, very, very scary, like if something were to change in your application, because nodes probably move all the time, right, when you're like changing the application. So that's why we recommend it as the last ditch effort to find an element. If you're having a hard problem and you need to find an element really quickly, sure, use an XPath. But just know that if the application changes, your test will more than likely break. So how do we find elements on an app that already exists? So the first thing I'm going to do is open up our Sauce demo app. Any questions about locators? No? Yes? Okay. So here's our application. This is the splash page, basically, of the application. And let's say we wanted to write a test for a login feature. What are the elements do you think we would need to identify before we do that? Just shout them out. Username, password, what else? Button? Login button, right? Those are probably all we would need. So we have two contact forms here. My browser stored the information. So we have a username contact form, password contact form, and then a button. How many of you have ever used dev tools from your browser before, just poking around just for fun? I'm sure manual testers you have a lot, very often. So that's exactly what we're going to do, right? Every browser is different, whether it's Safari, Firefox, or Chrome. In Chrome, you can easily locate an element by right-clicking it and then choosing Inspect. And it will actually open the dev tools for you. So right away, it's highlighted where the position of that element is in the actual HTML document. So if we go to the right here, and I'll try to make this a little bigger so you can see, we can see that it's an input type, and it has a class name called form input, and it actually has, I'm actually supposed to be highlighting the username. Okay. And it has a data test attribute that's called username. It has an ID called user-name, which can be confusing. It also has a placeholder attribute called username with an uppercase U. Okay, and you notice when I type something in there, it changes the DOM. It actually adds the value of what I put in there. But obviously, that's not going to help you for your test because you can't interact with an element before you find it. So what you're going to want to do is choose any one of these attributes to locate the element. Luckily, we have an ID, so we're going to use that, right? Same thing with password. So when I go to the password element, which is right below it, it has an ID of a password. Now, the problem is with the login button. So when we inspect the login button, it has a class, but that seems like a very generic class name, right? Button underscore action. I bet when we get to other pages, there's going to be other buttons called button dash action, right? And it also has a value of login, so that helps. So what do you think we should do here? Should we use a CSS locator that goes to that value attribute? That's probably what we should do. Or we can, what's that?
XPath.
Or we could use XPath based on the position of the node in the document. Someone said something? Value attribute, right? So those are the two options, XPath, value attribute. So what we're going to do is actually use a value attribute so I can show you how to use the dev console in Chrome tools. So down here, right here, underneath where it says styles, and this is a really cool tip for if you need to write your locators and you're not sure how to do it. When you want to test your locators before you actually put them in a script, I recommend doing it here. So how do you do that? Let's go back to the slides. So for CSS, it's going to be dollar sign, and then whatever's in parentheses is going to be your locating strategy. So for CSS, and I'm not going to get too deep into CSS locators because it's kind of out of scope for today's class, but I definitely recommend, if you're a nerd like me, Googling CSS locators and you'll see some hardcore locating strategies. But this is a basic class locator because we're using the username, which is indicated by the hash symbol there. If it was an ID, it would be, I believe, a dot. No, sorry, I have that backwards. I think hash is ID and dot is class. Yes, thank you, Enrique. He was about to correct me. Did you see his face? He was like, Anyway, so for XPath, it's very similar. You need $X, and then whatever is in your parenthesis, that would be your XPath string that you would use. The username, in my opinion, looks a little bit sexier, so we're going to stick with that one. But because we have an ID for the username object, this is kind of a little unnecessary. We can just use the username ID. But for the value attribute or the type attribute for what we're about to do is going to be a little different. So let's go back to the dev tools. And sorry, I'm just checking for time here. We're good on time, right?
Don't worry, you know I'm always checking on the time.
Okay, good.
How are we doing, by the way? Y'all feeling good? Feeling okay? Getting help from the TAs? We're all right? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do here is, question? Someone had a question? No? Okay. So we're actually going to either do one of two things. We're going to take the value attribute or the type attribute. I'm actually going to do the type attribute because it's specific to a submit button. So the way we would create our locator, and if you can't see it, I'll try to make it a little bigger. Okay, so we're going to do $. And right away, it's giving us some options here, right? So if we wanted to test to make sure our console's working correctly, we can do an easy one for a username. You click username, hit enter, and it's going to take you to where it is in the DOM, right? So let's go ahead and do a different one. Let's do $, parenthesis, colon, value, equals, and remember login was in, I believe it was in all caps, right? Yeah, it is in all caps, so it is a little case sensitive. Wow, is there a party going on there or what?
It's canceled.
Now because we're using an attribute selector, we should actually enclose it in brackets before we finish this. And right away, let me move this up a little bit. I think I can, right? No. There we go. So right away when I hit enter, it immediately identified that there's a button with a value of login. So this actually means that this selector, whatever's in this parentheses, is going to work in our script. And that's what we're going to use for our CSS selector. Okay? So you don't need to actually do this exercise. I just wanted to illustrate that it is really a good tool to test your selectors in the Chrome tools or the Safari tools or whatever before you actually decide to write your script. So let's remember this value for when we write our script. Okay. Any questions on DevTools? Nope. You guys are awesome. Okay. So now that we have our selector, now that we have our ID selectors, our CSS selector, it's time to write a script. So the first thing you're going to do, we already have the basic Selenium bindings set up. We know that because when we opened the browser via our script, it worked. But now we need to import another, or at least in this example, another 2 methods of the Selenium library. So we're going to use the by method and the web element object. So the web element is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a web element. You know you're going to create an instance of one, or at least create a reference to one that's in your script. So for here, these 2 lines here are actually importing the libraries. And this is where we're basically initializing an element called username element. And then this is the actual Selenium command here. So driver.findElement. And then we're using by to indicate how we're going to find it by its ID in the HTML DOM. And as you saw, it was username. Actually, I think it was user dash name, so that's not going to work. But we'll fix it in our script. And then same thing with the password element, right? Driver.findElement by ID password. Now with the submit, you notice that we're using class name here. That will work for this test, but we want to do something that's a little bit more strong in case something changes. So what we're going to do is make it a little bit more complicated in our own script. So if you go back to git pod, and you go to your script, which is in the local directory under local example RB. And let me actually clear the screen really quick. Oh, didn't mean to do that. OK, so below where it says @driver.get, we're going to create some locators here. So we're going to do @driver.find_element. And then we're going to do ID. And we're going to do user name. And let's just confirm that that is the actual ID name. And yes, so it is user-name. Then you can go ahead and copy and paste that same line below it and type in password. And then we will confirm that it is in fact called password, not with a capital P or anything. Yep, it is. OK, so for the last one, we are going to do a CSS locator. So this is going to be a little different. First, let me delete the value here, and then delete the ID. So for CSS, it's going to be CSS, as you could probably guess. Now, the cool thing of this is we can actually copy what we did down here. Oh, let me do this. We can actually copy this string value here, and we're pretty confident that it's going to work. So basically, quotation, bracket, value equals single quote, login, in single quote. So if we do that, make sure there's no random phantom spaces or anything. So we know this should work. So when we run the test again, what do we expect to happen? Probably nothing, right? Because we're not doing anything with those elements. We're just locating them. But we will know if it didn't work. We will get a null, I think it's null exception pointer. Is that what it's called? Yeah, null pointer exception, which means couldn't find the element. So as long as this didn't error out, you can assume that it found the elements. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do Ruby local / local example RB. Cool tip for kids using the command line. If you start typing something and hit tab, it will finish typing it for you. So that way you don't have to worry about fat fingers or misspelling something. OK, so let me refresh my browser window over here to make sure we actually see stuff happening. And didn't error out. So that means that it found the elements. All right, so I'm going to give everyone, does everyone need a minute or two to do that themselves, or they already got it running? All right, so it's 7:30. Let's go to the next step. We have 2 more steps, I think. So we've located our elements, but we haven't done anything yet, right? So the next thing we need to do is actually interact with those elements. And we do this by performing actions. So what actions look like are, these are actual commands, Selenium commands that you're going to be sending to those elements. So in the case of our username, password, and login, we're going to simulate a person actually typing on the keyboard. So we're going to send in the password and the username, not in that order, of course. And then we're going to click on the submit button once we've done those actions. So first thing, obviously it's not Peter Parker, it's just my Spider-Man joke. But the username, this would actually be a good test for an incorrect login, actually. So username Peter Parker, password Spider-Man, and then click on the button. So let's go ahead and do that next. So the first thing you want to do here is type in send keys. And I think for Ruby, it is C underscore keys. Yeah, right, guys? And because I already know the password, I'm just going to type it in. It's standard underscore user. Same thing with the password. Let me close this a little bit. Send underscore keys. And Tristan will like this. Guess what the password is? Secret sauce.
Ooh, it sounds like some shameless branding over here.
And then finally for the login, you can probably guess what action you're going to do. Click. And then that's it. So save that, run it again, and what you should see is this. And make sure you refresh your browser or your VM. You should see it lightning fast, input some stuff, and then it goes to the next page in the app. So what that looks like if I were to do that in real time, I'm just going to copy it because I know I'm going to mistype it. It should land on this page. That's how you know the test passed. But so we run it one more time for those who didn't see it happen because it was so fast. Should be encouraging though that it runs so fast, right? Yes, you can do that. We just don't recommend it when you're actually writing a test to like make the thread sleep.
I mean, not for us.
Yeah, for you to see. You're right. You're right. I just don't remember what it is in Ruby. Do you guys remember what it is? Wait. No, see. Yeah, we don't know Ruby. I don't know. How about this? What if I just comment out the driver quit? Just leave it open. Yeah, that's like really bad. You want to get bad, I can get worse. Okay, so don't do this at home. Maybe it was cached. Oh, you didn't save. Oh, I didn't save? No, yeah, you're right, I didn't. Didn't follow my own instructions.
Thank you, TA Michael. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. He's our professor. What was that? Good work, team. Good work.
Just make sure. This is actually not that important. I just wanted to show it landing on the page. Whatever.
It's okay.
It's better to write your test correctly than to try to not write it correctly. Okay, so who actually got this to work, even though it was lightning fast? Okay, cool. So we're almost there. We are almost there. The last thing you need to do to complete this test is expected results. And what we call that is assertions. So we need to write a test assert. We need to assert that it worked the way we intended it to, and if not, fail. Or at least we mark it as failed. So the way this works in Java, in most languages, is we're going to define a string variable, which is going to be, okay, which is going to be, so let me start over for video purposes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to write a test assertion. We're going to write a string variable called actual result, and we're going to take that variable and we're going to pass another Selenium command into it. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to query the current URL at the end of our test, which should be, I think, this page. Yes, saucedemo.com/inventory.html. And if the test, once the test completes, if that is not the case, it's going to we're going to use this is basically a pseudo regular expression. If it is the current URL, we're going to mark it as passed. If it's not the current URL, we're going to mark it as failed. And then I'm going to print out in the console, it passed or failed. So let's go ahead and do this in Ruby. So what this is going to look like, and you can do this anywhere in between your action commands and in between the quit. So first we're going to do actual result equals at driver dot get current. Oh no, it's not even a get, my bad. I'm still thinking in Java world. Current URL. And then we're going to do equals equals, and then the actual string of that URL. So it'll be HTTPS, what is it, saucedemo.com/inventory.html. Okay, we're not done yet though. Now we need to actually write that regular expression, and we'll do it at the very end here. So we're going to do passed or failed. And then that's it. Of course, if you want, you can write it out to the console, and I think it's,
You can show the part what is pending now.
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, finish. After that,
Oh.
just show that part.
No, that's not right. It's, I'm still thinking Java. Too many quotes. There we go. I heard the developer being like, nope, nope, nope. Was that you? Like, nope, nope, wrong, nope. I love that. Okay, so this should work. Make sure it's saved. The test failed. Maybe it's because I typed it wrong. Oh, I forgot the most crucial part. www.saucedemo.com. World Wide Web, folks. World Wide Web. Hey, at least we know it failed when I wrote it incorrectly. There, test passed. Question?
You can receive the 24, okay.
Okay, you want me to make it bigger?
No, that's good.
Oh, too big. Okay. All right, so this concludes our test, at least locally. So I will give everyone a minute or two. And anyone get here yet? Anyone finish their test? Okay, so what's next? This is, I promised, the last slide. You're going to put on your automation hat now. And there's my last Spider-Man meme of the day. You're all now Gryffindor automation hat testers. So honestly, though, what do you do next? So you've written your first automated test. Obviously, this is just a simple test to get you started. You may not even be doing it in the real world. You wouldn't be committing it to a group project or anything. So you need to practice. You need to do more complex scenarios like test for cookie injection. Maybe you need to actually leapfrog to a different page in an app. And instead of going like you would normally, page by page by page, there are ways that you can actually use Selenium to your advantage and inject data to switch to kind of circumvent pages, right? Maybe you need to test on a mobile app. Luckily, the Appium is a wrapper for Selenium, so a lot of the stuff you learn in Selenium will carry over, but there are certain other variables you need to be aware of, like which view you are on, or maybe like there's gestures you need to be aware of, or like accelerometers. Do people even use accelerometers anymore? I don't know. Then you have to make your code better. So once you get all your tests working, you need to refactor them and make sure that they are optimized for scale, which this is where we talk about the page object model. So if you're curious, I actually have most or not all of these examples in the Ruby directory in this project. So if you go to local and you go to sauce here, and let me actually clear some screens so you can see some stuff. And actually let me log into Sauce Labs here. This is our only shameless plug of the day, I swear. Okay. So if you're not aware, Sauce Labs automated testing platform. The benefit here is we ran one test locally on one version of a browser. On Sauce Labs, you can scale it out and run it on multiple versions of multiple tests, right? Multiple devices, multiple OSs, et cetera. So how do we run that same test that we just ran, but how do we run it on Sauce Labs? Okay? So if we go to sauce here in the directory, and you go down to sauce_example, it's already ready for you to go. The big things you need to be aware of are your user and access key. So if you have an account with us, you have to input that data. And this is really the only thing you need to change in your entire test, is how you create the web driver. Because you're not creating it on your laptop anymore. You're calling out to our platform to create it for you, right? And with that comes a certain parameters that you need to pass through it. So what browser, what OS, what version, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all here in this capabilities object that you see. So I'm basically telling the browser, I'm not going to run the test, but, or should I? Should I run the test? Should I? I'll do it. Okay.
Yeah.
So browser name, let's do Chrome. Let's do what? Latest. Platform name. Windows 10. Because we did a Mac test, right? Or at least I did. Or we did a Linux test. And if this doesn't work, you guys can fix it for me. And we basically run the same command we were running earlier. So we do Ruby, except this time I'm going to do sauce, and then sauce example. And I don't think it's going to run in this right-hand side over here because we're calling out to our platform. So if I switch, this is looking promising. So if I switch here, you can see that I'm running it here, testing sauce demo site. I need to work on my grammar. But, and then because it passed, we marked it as a check. Another cool thing about Sauce Labs is you can actually download and record screenshots and videos so that if you need to show like, you know, your Scrum manager or your PMs or whomever, you can do so. So it's basically the same test. It also runs a lot slower than it did locally, so you can actually see what we did. And that's that. So essentially the same thing we did on our laptop, we now have done in Sauce Labs. And then feel free to play with this if you sign up for a free trial. We have some parallel examples. So we're running similar tests. I think it's actually the same exact test. And actually, let me see if there's a, would it be rake? What is it? You don't need to worry about this. Rake, parallel run? I think it's parallel run. No. Any Ruby people here? Nah, don't worry about it. I'll figure it out later. But anyway, so if I could figure out the right command, I would be able to run multiple tests on Sauce Labs at the same time. We do have some demos in our training repo that you were just in, where you can pull these down, and there's multiple examples in multiple languages like demo Python, C#, et cetera, that walks you through all of these scenarios. Okay, so that's it for me. Last thing I want to leave you with, because this is a Selenium Meetup, the most important thing are your resources that are not sponsored by us, but rather the community, right? So you have your developer tutorials, you have Selenium HQ. Elemental Selenium is a really good blog by one of the co-founders of, I think, of our company, right? Yeah, I think it's Huggins.
With that said, I just want to make
Yeah.
it real clear here. So are we going to be able to have this as a resource after?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you.
The slides are actually in the repo. So if you pull down the repo, you have these same slides.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love our deep there.
So that's it for me. I guess I'll stop talking now and walk around and help everyone.
Can I get a round of applause? This
network.
is James' first meetup as well.